Home Abstract and Title Company was founded in 1867 and is the oldest company still operating in McLennan County. Home Abstract is comprised of a team of honest, friendly, hardworking professionals dedicated to providing both commercial and residential real estate clients with the highest level of communication and service. Their team is committed to working hard and building and maintaining strong relationships because transactions are so much more than just deals. They are clients, deserving of the courtesy, care, and respect that Home Abstract and Title Company is known for. Visit Home Abstract and Title Company at homeabstract.com.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. This is episode 2 in the Crossroads series that is a joint project between me and Rick Tullis. Welcome back, Rick.
Hey, so glad to be back. Thank you for having me, and I'm so excited you can count to 2.
Well, I wrote it down. So we're excited to be working through this series we talked about last time, and we're going to kind of move this chronologically in a sense, but we'll break down thematically as well. And so we thought we would back up from last episode's conversation. If you haven't heard episode 1 of Crossroads, go back and take a listen to that now. But if you have, stay tuned as we'll press into a historical overview. Right, Rick?
That's right. We're gonna go all the way back to the beginning.
We're gonna start with Adam and Eve, and then we're gonna work our way.
Okay, fast forward just a little bit. Let's get not quite that far back.
But I think we can promise you by the end of the episode today, we'll get you through the 19th century. So we'll get you through the 1800s before we end today's episode. But Rick's been doing research. He's been very focused on doing research on early Waco. So he's going to start us out with how we should think about Waco's Crossroads even early in its history.
Yeah, Stephen, I thought it'd be interesting to look at the earliest contact and the earliest times that the Waco was a crossroads for someone. Obviously, and you've done some great episodes on the Native Americans that were here, and so there's some known there about their lives. They don't have the same kind of written history, so we don't have all the same context, but it does cross paths here. So in one thing I came across was in 1772, there was a Spanish explorer who happened to be the governor of Louisiana at the time. I'm going to butcher his name, Athanase de Mazara.
It's like I was transported to Spain.
Yeah, were you there?
Yeah.
Did you feel it? Yeah. Could you feel it? And he was on a trek going up the Brazos, and in his writings or in his notes, he notes 2 significant villages on the Brazos River, which corresponds to where we are today. So that's probably one of the earliest historical references to what we now know as Waco.
All right, really interesting. Does he say anything else about it in this early reference?
No.
So that's it. Two little villages on the Brazos.
Yeah,
is
well,
what
and I don't know if this is true or not, but we a lot of the names around here are Spanish. Bosque, for one, that river. So I don't know if that was the journey, the expedition where the names were given to Brazos is the full name of the Brazos is a very Spanish name as well. So I don't know if they were the ones, if they went up and how far they went. I'm not sure.
Okay, and so we're talking 1772. This is the kind of the northeast perimeter of New Spain.
Yeah,
is kind of this landscape we're talking about. Really interesting.
Yeah. All
right, so so we have a bit of information on 1772. Then when does the record help us again?
Well, so in looking at it, about 50 years later. So Stephen F. Austin, and we know how important he was to the western settling of Texas. But 1824, he had his colony going, and I guess they were running into trouble with the Wacos, and he sent a delegation up to the Waco villages to meet with them to negotiate some kind of peace treaty because they weren't getting along. I think there were some raids going on there, and some would say it wasn't just a delegation, but as oftentimes happens in these strategic meetings, they were doing a little reconnaissance too.
Mm-hmm.
So they captured some information about the area. And in that, they talked about, there's really two villages. They're real close together. And if you added up the houses in both of them, it was a little less than 50 houses, about 100 men, right? They would want to know how many fighting age males they had to deal with. And a couple hundred acres of corn were being farmed at the time. So a significant establishment for sure.
Yeah. And this is at the point where the colony, that is a contingent that could have been threatening to the Texas colony.
Yeah.
Not a very substantial Anglo presence in Texas at that point.
Right. Pretty thin at that point. Although it's interesting when you look at those maps, they show these counties or these settlements. I guess they were settlements at the time. That they were drawn out on paper that went all the way almost to the Red River.
Yeah.
It's like they'd never been that far, but they certainly wanted to take a claim over those lands, even though they had never seen them before.
Yeah. Well, I would suspect that theme of kind of defense and security would be one that might bring the new colony back into the area. So does that turn out to be the case? Yeah.
Well, and I'm not sure if this is where you're going with it, but think of what we know about Fort Fisher. And when it was established in 1837, a group of Texas Rangers were sent up here. So obviously, between 1824 and 1837, a lot's happened, right? That's Texas has gotten its independence, and now they're trying to organize themselves and protect themselves. I mean, it's kind of a two-front war. They've got the Mexicans on one side, and they've got hostile Indians all around. And so they made the strategic decision to send a group of Rangers upriver to establish an outpost at what we now know as Fort Fisher. And in that group of Texas Rangers, a guy named George Erath, who ends up being important to Waco's future. We'll see in a minute. It's funny, we think of in Waco now, there is a Fort Fisher. We go by all the time. I don't think that's historically the accurate place where the actual fort was. They describe a place that seems a little different, but sounds like it's close. But they were only here 3 weeks, so it's like it wasn't like Fort Ticonderoga or something. I mean, it was a short-lived fort, and then they pulled back. The state officials wanted them to pull back because they thought they were too far beyond the frontier to do any good. So Marlin Falls, we've talked about that before as a crossroads because it had a great low water crossing. There were a few settlers in that area, so they pulled back to that area.
Okay. I've even seen something recently where they've talked about maybe relocating Fort Fisher and folks being up in arms about the possibility of doing that. And it is the traditional home of where Fort Fisher was, but probably not the actual home place where Fort Fisher was. Right. Yeah.
In the Erath talks about it being close to a big spring and all that, which probably describes something a little closer, further upriver, maybe where the Suspension Bridge area is, where you can still see all those springs going today.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Cool.
You can walk down below, although it may be blocked off right now, and you can still see those springs flowing. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So
one thing I was going to, in his own words, share a little bit with what Erath had to say, just to give you a feel from the source at the time, what it was like to do what they did. So he says, this is from Erath's writing, in the fall of 1836, a battalion of Rangers was organized, and one company under the command of Captain Barron was stationed at the falls of the Brazos. Of this company, the writer was a subaltern officer. We were ordered early in the year 1837 to establish a fort at Waco Village. We were there. We were 3 weeks coming up. So think of that. To get from Marlin to Waco took them 3 weeks. There might have been a few things in the way.
They should have taken the highway. Yeah.
Well, there's always that cop and Riesel, so they wanted to make sure they didn't. We were 3 weeks coming up, having found it necessary to cut a road and build a bridge over Cow Bayou. We expected to occupy the fort permanently. Waco was in the possession of Buffalo and only a short time before had been vacated by the Waco Indians. Corn stalks were found in the fields that had been cultivated and peach trees were growing where the city now stands. We built some shanties for barracks near the big spring on the river, but only remained there 3 weeks when an order came from the Secretary of War for us to return to the falls as we were too far to do any good. We went back, calling the place we had left Fort Fisher. Yeah, I think it's interesting as we talk about crossroads and travel. It wasn't easy to travel back then, right? I don't know if they were all on horseback or if they actually had wagons. I'm sure they were taking supplies and stuff. But yeah, the terrain and having to clear out roads isn't like we think of roads now. Our context is much different. We drive down I-35 and we see bulldozers and track hose doing all that work. Well, for these guys, it was a hatchet and manpower. Maybe use their horse to pull some stuff out of the way. But
yeah, slow and difficult work in a place where think of today we're on a day where it's raining quite a bit. I mean, just think what the conditions would have been like.
Yeah,
on a day like today.
And when it was time for lunch or dinner break, it wasn't like they just, jumped over to Jack in the Box and got something. They had to go find food, kill it, process it. A lot more of their day was spent in subsistence living than we spend today. So
I hope you're not eating Jack in the Box, Rick. Man at your age needs to think about nutrition.
Sourdough
more than
they
that.
Got the sourdough bun. Really
anyway. So this is the Republic period. So this is Republic of Texas period. What else is kind of going on in that era?
Well, so soon after.
One note to make, I think, that we learned from that source is this vibrant village or two villages that we heard described earlier. Something had changed.
They weren't there anymore
in the intervening years. Yeah.
They weren't there, and there's probably certainly some thoughts on why they left. There's different theories out there. The disease was one of them that had taken a toll on the Native American population. And there wasn't just the fighting that was going on with the settlers. There was a lot of fighting between different tribes, and who knows how that might have had an effect one way or the other.
Yeah, but there's a lot of pressure on indigenous peoples at the time. Yeah.
Yes, and it must have been just an incredibly hard way of life as well. I mean, we're talking about the settlers who had a few more, modern amenities for the time, but it was a hard life for everyone. All right, so my next kind of crossroads contact in that time period was something called the Santa Fe Expedition. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I know it came through the area, but I don't know a lot of details about it.
Yeah. So Lamar, I think he was the president at the time, decided, hey, we want to. He stated explicitly, we want to set up a trading relationship with the Mexicans in Santa Fe. Now, I think there was also this desire that, hey, hopefully maybe they'll want to come over to our side, but we're going to go as a mercantile group and really try to set up a trading route. Yes.
Yeah.
There'd been, and to his point, there'd been some similar ones set up. I think St. Louis to Santa Fe was a trading route at the time that was successful. And so to do that, they put together a couple hundred guys, some with a military background. A lot of them were merchants, and a lot of them were just people new to Texas who wanted to see the world and explore what was going on. And one of those guys is a guy named George Wilkins Kendall. He actually wrote an account of the whole trip, which turns out to be great for us because we're going to see a little bit of that in a second. So the expedition leaves out of Austin and comes up through this area. And at the time, you got to keep in mind, no one had ever gone from Austin to Santa Fe. There wasn't a road. There wasn't a path. There wasn't even a map that actually spelled out exactly where to go. I think they had a couple of guides who kind of thought maybe they knew where to go. And
so as a result, they're taking the long way there.
We'll see. They kind of take the never way there, but they at the beginning of the trip, they've got a lot of wagons loaded with goods. They've got a couple hundred people. They're bringing their own cattle for food. They've got a bunch of cattle with them, and so this group's making its way really up that I-35 corridor that we talked about in the last show. That was really a natural pathway, but they knew at some point they had to start going west.
Mm-hmm.
And where that broke seems to be, when you read the book, they'd camped somewhere around Little River. There was an old fort there,
mm-hmm.
Frontier Fort. They'd stayed there, and then they cut across the plains. It would have been not like we see now where there's trees and stuff. It would have been pretty barren, open ground, pretty easy travel. And the accounts are really interesting there. They come across lots of buffalo, like the guy's describing buffalo as far as the eye could see,
mm-hmm.
Which is really interesting. In our time, we don't get that. And we know, and it's described, they cross at a place on the North Bosque River called Eichelberg Crossing, which is there today. I mean, you can actually, in modern times, which is often the case, a trail turns into a road, turns into a highway, whatever. I mean, it's not a highway, but there is a significant road that's through Eichelberg Crossing now.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it'd be interesting to hear a quick description of what Wilkins had to say here. So, and again, talking about the difficulty of travel, and he says, we had already, and with no inconsiderable difficulty, crossed one branch of the Bosque, which I would say that's the South Bosque if you look at how the rivers are lined up. And on the evening of the 5th arrived another fork of the same stream, which would be the Middle Bosque at that point, where we encamped for the night. It abounds with excellent trout. I hear a little bit of a pause there. We don't have trout.
Yeah.
But as far as he knew, they were trout. I'm sure they were bass and soft-shell turtle. This day, for the first time, we saw the antelope or mountain goat, an animal somewhat resembling both the deer and the goat, but with flesh preferable to that of either. It runs with great speed and has a stride like a horse.
All right, what's that? That's
pronghorn antelope is what he's describing, which, you're not going to see those around here any longer until you get up in the high plains area.
Mm-hmm.
So then he goes on the early part of the 6th of July, we spent cutting a road through a thick belt of wood, which skirts either side of the main branch of the Bosque. So I think they're getting close to this Eichelberg crossing area now. And in partially digging away the high steep banks of the stream. The labor of crossing the river was incredible. In descending the abrupt banks which led to the channel, it was necessary not only to lock the wheels, but to hold back the wagons with ropes to prevent them from pitching down head first, as it were. The greatest difficulty, however, was in ascending the other side. The ascent was nearly perpendicular and some 40 feet high, with no better footing than deep sand. Some 20 yoke of oxen would, in the first place, be hitched to the wagon, then ropes would be attached wherever there was a place to make them fast, manned with about 50 or 60 of the fatigued party. Finally, all the drivers would be called in requisition, and when all was ready for a start, such a jumping, whipping, cranking, yelling, pulling, cursing, and swearing would arise as it set all description at defiance. So just imagine doing that day after day. I mean,
I think of that in Waco history terms. That just lets you know how ideal a crossing the suspension bridge area was, as opposed to a crossing like that. How difficult that crossing was.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the rivers in Texas, are certainly in this part of Texas, they don't tend to be like the beautiful streams you see in a picture of a mountain meadow where you have this gently sloping bank and you can walk down to the river. I mean, our rivers are ditches with 20, 30, 40-foot drops.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the water channel, and then it's another 20, 30-foot rise on the other side. And so they would have to cut these approaches, right? They would
Mm-hmm.
they would send out parties to cut down the banks so they could get the wagons in and out. A little side note: I've got a farm on the Middle Bosque, and not too far from me, there are a couple of these places where approaches have been cut, and I often have wondered, were one of those the original cuts that these guys made in 1841?
Yeah.
I'll never know, but it's fun to think about.
So what is the fruit of that expedition?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a whole nother story, probably a whole nother podcast. But yeah, those guys end up getting lost. They never, they were trying to get to the Red River and then follow it west. They never find the Red River. The guy who was guiding them ends up running off because he figures out that he doesn't know what he's doing, and so somewhere up in the Paladera Canyon area, they're stuck. They can't get up. They can't get out of the canyon, and they're out of food. The guys are sick. They're getting attacked frequently, and their horses are getting stolen. They're out of cattle. They're starting to starve. There aren't any buffalo around that area. So they end up sending out a small group that was still well enough. And this. I'm sorry, George Kendall. I think I call him Wilkins. I'm going to go George Wilkins Kendall was part of the group that's, hey, we're just going to go into Santa Fe and get help, and we'll come back and get these guys. Well, the Mexican authorities there, the governor, had gotten intel that these guys were coming, right? Somebody had seen their big party coming across the plains and stuff. So anyway, he captures them, and then finds out the other guys are there, goes and captures the rest of them. They never make it to Santa Fe. He executes a few of them, threatens to execute more of them. But anyway, in essence, then they all get marched down to Mexico City on foot. So they've almost died going to Santa Fe. Now they got to walk all the way to Mexico City on foot under horrible conditions and under threat of death. And then it gets down there, gets a little fuzzy. Some of them escape. Some of them get let go, and then a lot of them make their way back to Texas. And in fact, one of them is a guy we're going to talk about next.
I know, who was an employee at the time of the Torrey brothers. But you tell us about him.
Well, George Barnard.
Yeah.
Barnard.
Yeah.
I got to say that right. George Barnard was on that expedition, and though he makes the round trip back up to Waco. You want to? What do you know about the Torrey?
Yeah, so the Torrey Brothers Trading Company started in Houston in 1838, and Barnard is working for them in Houston, and they franchised. So there's New Braunfels, San Antonio. They have several of these trading posts that are established, but then Barnard comes into local lore by leading the Torrey Brothers post that's established near Waco.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that I thought was interesting, putting that trading post in was actually a requirement of a treaty with the Indians, the Texas Indians. They negotiated, being the savvy negotiators they are, negotiated, hey, we want a trading post out here closer to us, and that's why that got put. Actually just downriver from where we would call Waco now. So somewhere between Cow Bayou and Tawankana Creek.
About 8 miles below Waco Indian Village. So about 8 miles from Waco.
Yeah.
And so it's George Barnard, who's a 26-year-old native of Connecticut, and his brother Charles are the ones that kind of moved there in 1844, becoming some of the first white settlers in the region. But so the Indian groups would have wanted them there just for trade. I mean, because the indigenous groups are very involved by that point in the trade in both deer hides, buffalo hides. And so you can think about, for economics, for them, it's handy to have an outlet where they can do trade.
Right. And, they were mining basically the local resource in order to convert that to something of value they could go get something for. I was looking at some of the figures of what they were trading, and I want to say it was 75,000 hides a year.
Yeah, 75,000 in deer hides alone. That's in a period. So between 44 and 53, 1844 and 1853, when Waco gets established, he's going to want to move in town.
Right.
But through that period, they handle 75,000 deer hides. They're handling buffalo hides as well. Black bears were still prevalent in the area, so they're handling a lot of different hides.
Yeah.
There was still beaver in the area in considerable numbers at that point too.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that when we look at the demise, I've always associated the demise of a lot of that wildlife, just like we were talking about the pronghorn antelope a minute ago, was directly related to when the settlers got here, and agriculture started and all that stuff. But it's interesting to think, and I never really considered that. The indigenous population was actually motivated to reduce those animal populations because that was their trade currency.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because they're shipping these out, right? So, I mean, local Indian groups are now connected in the global trade networks, and some of the things that Barnard had in stock would be like gunpowder, lead, bullet molds, hatchets, colored beads, blankets, cloth, dress combs. Tobacco was in really high demand. And Barnard's would be a place that you could go. You could also buy whiskey there if you wanted to. Yeah. And so it was an active concern.
Well, kind of bring it back to modern times. Most people know where Trading House Lake is. Mm-hmm. It gets its name because it was close to this trading house that we're describing.
That's right.
That's the general area.
Yeah. Good. That gives us a good kind of reference point for where it was. One of the interesting things, we have good records. So the Texas collection has good records of kind of some of the activity at the trading post. And one of the interesting things I found is some of the stuff that Barnard ordered for himself, which include like silk underwear and things like that. I mean, you get the sense that he was kind of a fancier fella by some of the stuff that he ordered for his personal use.
Yeah, well, that is very useful out on the frontier.
So that trading post actually, I want to just clarify, that trading post stands there until 1929. So it's sold by Barnard to actually some Jewish settlers, but he moves his kind of general store, sets up an office in Waco in the early 1850s.
Yeah, and I think by all accounts was one of the wealthiest occupants in Waco or citizens, and did a lot for the early days of Waco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that gets us up to, we already talked about it a little bit, and I think Erath maybe comes back into the picture here. Now. Yeah.
So so it was 1842, right, when it was the trading house was established. So then there's kind of this period of surveyors going out, of settlers, looking for claims to make. But there was a lot of tensions at this point with the indigenous folks. So there wasn't a huge push into the area. So there's not a lot written about the next few years, and at least that I could find now. Now in this book, one of the books that we keep referencing, I don't think we mentioned this earlier, is a handbook of Waco and McLennan County, and I've got a version from 1876 that I'm looking at that's got these personal accounts from George E. Rath and some of the other characters from the early history. So that's what we're pulling from. And so he describes, going on many missions, and he's got a guy with him who often helps him out, a guy named Neil McLennan, and he ends up being, Barnard was probably the first permanent resident of what we would call now McLennan County. McLennan was kind of the first settler. He's when they were out surveying land, saw this beautiful place in what they called the South Bosque Valley, which right now is under Lake Waco. So if you were, you ever been to the park in Woodway that overlooks the lake?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Beautiful spot. Well, if the water wasn't there and you were looking kind of back to the northwest towards Hog Creek, that's where Neil McLennan settled and
so that park would be one rim of the valley, or one kind of edge of the valley.
Yeah. You're sitting there on the edge of the water, but really you took the water away. There's probably another 30, 40 foot drop down in there to what would have been the actual water course that ran through there.
It would have been beautiful.
It would have been beautiful.
Yeah.
In fact, when they were out surveying and McLennan saw this area as they were surveying their way up the South and Middle Bosque, he fell in love with the area. And, it was probably took about 8 or 9 or 10 years later when he came back and actually built a house and established his homestead there.
Mm-hmm. Could we say cabin would be more accurate than a house?
Maybe, maybe not quite up to your standards as a house, but, you might see this on the map too. I like how what we know currently ties back to history.
Mm-hmm.
There's a road called McLennan Crossing when you get on the other side of the river off of Spiegelville Road, and that was Neil McLennan's crossing. That wasn't McLennan County crossing. That was Neil McLennan's crossing that went by his house and crossed the South Bosque River and came up basically where Estates Drive, that kind of area right there, and carried on towards Waco. And that was the main road that connected Gatesville and several other places to Waco that went across that crossing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
Okay, so those guys, Erath, McLennan, some other guys are out doing not only surveying, they're doing a lot of Texas Rangering in there as well when things get hostile. Well, about 1848-49 was when Erath got the job to work for Cordova, de Cordova, to lay out the town that became known as Waco. So I was going to read a little bit of that. So
so de Cordova working as land agent, Erath working as surveyor, kind of organize and lay out. Yeah.
Yep. So early in 1848, I received orders from J.D. Cordova from J.S. Snyder of Galveston, who was the owner of the 2-league Chambers grant, to divide the same into lots for sale at $1 per acre.
It's a good deal.
I bet the property taxes were low on that. I made the surveys in May, but owing to a cloud on the title, advised that the grant be relocated with certificates to perfect title. There is a whole story there on a legal battle that raged for years over some of this land. I fancied that Waco would make an important town. I love this part, by the way. I fancied that Waco would make an important town for my earliest visits to the place on account of its central location to the state, it being above the swamps and lowlands below and the many forks of water courses and broken lands above. I'm a big fan of Chamber of Commerce here. And, that's a lot of what we say now. Now, we don't talk about the swamps and lowlands anymore, but, the central location of Waco is still one of our major selling points for this community.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. And this ties back to our that great air conditioning podcast we did.
Yeah, if drop your device now and tune back to listen to the history of. Actually, I think Mike Hamilton, our producer, originally dubbed it "The History of AC in Waco," and some reason that wasn't sexy enough. So now it's "How Waco Got Cool." So check that out. That's what Rick told us.
And I'm glad there's no sarcasm in your voice there. So, but swamps were a problem because people realized they were getting sick around swamps, right?
Uh-huh.
Yellow fever, what we call malaria now. And Waco was above that line in the state of Texas where people would get yellow fever.
Mm-hmm.
So that made it a very desirable place. In fact, there's some documentation in the same handbook that's one of the reasons they moved Baylor from its original location
in Independence. Because it's below the line and Waco's above. Yeah, interesting.
It's not good for business when your students keep dying.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So I love that part. He goes on to say, I was instructed to lay off the town and sell lots. A plan was furnished me with permission to change it to suit the locality. The place was to be called Lamartine, from which I dissented. As no deeds were to be made immediately and no records made, the name was not settled till the 5th of May, when it was agreed by all to call it Waco Village.
Yeah, so
we were that close to be doing the Lamartine History Podcast.
I know, yeah. And so there's some debate over where that name came from. Some say it was Lamar that you mentioned earlier, but there's also a French hero, Lamartine, that supposedly it was de Cordova's wife that pushed the name Lamartine to honor this French hero. But yes, we were that close to being Lamartine.
They would have totally changed this podcast. Yeah, so that was the original layout of the town. Lots were going pretty cheap. It talked about selling them for $1, but he goes on to talk about when they actually had their auction to sell lots. He says, I ran out block number 1 in the front of the block opposite. There were as many lots as were wanting. Captain Ross took 2 or 3. George Barnard, the corner lot. Puckett, 1 or 2. The names of the other parties who invested I have forgotten. $5 each was the highest price agreed upon for the lots. I then ran off Main Street as far as Captain Ross's farming lots, which by contract he was to have for $1.25 per acre. The foundations of Waco were laid.
Interesting, yeah. So Shapley Ross, who we haven't mentioned yet, of course, is very connected to this story as well.
Plays big.
Is going to be a prominent citizen for the first 30 or so years of Waco.
Yeah. And in fact, he back to the Crossroads theme. I mean, he was a big part of that because he established the commercial venture of having a ferry. So it was pre-bridge, no bridge, and he ran a ferry across the river.
Yeah, it was part of his agreement for coming here that he'd have exclusive rights to kind of run that ferry. So, but he also was as they would call him in the day, kind of an Indian fighter. And so having his presence in the town, again, they're thinking about how to market their new town, would be reassuring as well.
Right.
So Waco's off to a start. I guess not the city, but the village of Waco in the early period, not incorporated until 1856. But I know they work very hard early on to ensure Waco is the county seat. That was important to de Cordova and Erath for Waco's prosperity going forward. They donate some land to ensure that that's the case.
Right. It actually had to be carved out of Milam County, I believe. And at that time, I think Milam County was this huge expanse of land that obviously has been broken up into many counties at this point. So,
as we kind of move forward, we've had podcasts talk about the Civil War in Waco. We obviously know some of the antebellum way of life in Waco in the 1850s. How should we pick up on that theme of kind of Crossroads going forward? What do you think would be next to kind of think about?
Well, so the handbook I have here, the 1876 handbook. So that was roughly 25 years after the founding, which, in the stretch of time doesn't seem too long ago or too long of a time to pass, but it was rapid expansion, right? They were a frontier town, a lot of things happening. So they go from a guy laying out lots to, in this time frame in 1876, they've got the suspension bridge across the river, which in and of itself was a major technological breakthrough. They got their first railroad. I think it was called the Tap Railroad. It actually was a tap off of another railroad that ran from Dallas to Houston.
It was a tap, I think, to Bremond, kind of coming into Waco that way.
Yeah. You definitely, these trails were developing more into roads and getting more movement of people and goods. We're starting to get in the heart of the cattle movement, the Chisholm Trail being a spot on the Chisholm Trail. A lot of that commerce coming through. cotton is figuring big into the economy. And it's not just the agricultural part of cotton, but you also got to process that cotton. So there's all the industries associated with that. People talks about not just cotton mills, but also woolen mills. I think sheep was a much bigger commodity. Most of the cattle, they were free-ranging cattle. They would gather them up and they were taking them to market. They didn't really have the advanced breeds of cattle that we have now. That really started happening later on. They were still, if you can go find cows for free, you're going to keep doing that.
Yeah,
so more of the livestock that was being kept was sheep and goats and other things that were not feral.
Yeah, that cows for free thing, begins to play out by the time you get to late 1870s, early 1880s. But it was a sweet age while it lasted.
Yeah. So in another interesting excerpt from the manual or from the handbook. So you had a great episode on hotels, and the McClellan Hotel was kind of the top of the creme de la creme of hotels for Waco at the time, and right there on Austin Avenue and where all the action was happening. So there's a little description in here. I won't read it all, but there's a few parts that might give us a taste of what downtown Waco was like at the time. So again, just 25 years after its founding. Okay, so from the cupola of the McClellan Hotel, a charming view of the city and its surroundings may be enjoyed. Keep in mind, he's trying to sell the place too. So not the hotel, but Waco to whoever's going to get this handbook. From that elevated standpoint, the beholder looks immediately down into the Austin Street and into the public square nearby and beholds, during the months known as the cotton season, a scene of bustling activity as it renders it difficult to realize that only a few years ago the ground now occupied by mammoth houses and traversed by these crowded thoroughfares of business was trodden only by the buffalo's hoof and the moccasined foot of the Indian. So dramatic. Yeah, I mean it's no different than we go to parts of our city now where someone just built a new subdivision and go, this was a cornfield 5 years ago, right? So then he looks down. He kind of gives a description of looking down the streets, and so looking down the valley, he sees long streets lined in each side for a few squares by stores in which dealers, large and small, are exchanging their wares for current funds, or for the products of the fertile acres of this and other counties, or with shops in which busy artisans are working out their own private fortunes and adding to the country's wealth. I thought it's interesting. He talked about current funds. Money as we know it was not as available, so it was a much more of a bartering type economy.
Currency and credit weren't nearly as available as they are now.
They when they're talking about how far the city's come, also it's interesting. They talk about how many brick buildings there are. Like they give a literal count in here of, we had this many buildings made out of brick.
Yeah.
Brick buildings didn't burn down as easy as wood buildings, and it was a sign of more wealth and more permanence. Thought that was interesting. So eastward, so remember he's on top of this cupola, and he's looking eastward down Austin Avenue. Eastward is seen the Noble Suspension Bridge. It was noble. It's pretty good. Noble Suspension Bridge, across which from morn to eve there flows a constant stream of business and travel. Beyond this are the very busy streets of East Waco, the handsome railroad depots, and still further on the large buildings of the Waco cotton mills, erected just at the point where the alluvial valley of the river gives place to the post oak belt that extended 5 miles beyond. So there were still lots of forest lands out that way too. It goes on, I guess, describing some of the other businesses. There's planing mills because lumber was important.
Yeah.
You think about, why the indigenous people moved, had a village there. And it actually is a lot of the same reasons these settlers would put a village there, right? A source of water, a place to get close to the water, but not getting flooded out all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, there had to be a little bit of elevation. Fertile lands close by to farm and produce food. But you also needed wood because there was no, that was the main source for really any kind of heat or cooking or whatever. So you had to be, in an area where you had wood or have access. Later on, I think a lot of that starts getting supplied by the railroad from East Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've seen those old maps, and so you have lumber companies. Most of them were in what maps call East Waco, Texas. I mean, they're labeling it kind of as a separate community, but I know that the Cameron Lumber Company was just there across the river. So
yeah. So,
by this point that you're talking about is when Waco is really coming into its own as the kind of capital of the inland cotton market in Texas. I mean, it is the point of exchange. We need to make the point that the old system of slave labor had given way to the new system of tenancy and sharecropping, which, while it granted people rights, I'm putting this in air quotes, generally put them in recurring debt and a situation where they weren't tied legally to ownership, but debt wise they were often tied to the land.
Right.
But it is a time where it's really the heyday for cotton as far as its place in the local economy.
Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting. We've talked about we're having another Crossroads episode just on commerce and really digging into that a little bit more, looking at how much was being produced then and how it grew exponentially, and really how Waco was the westernmost place that you could actually grow cotton at the time. It moved as cotton got better, but and farming techniques got better. But yeah, that ends up being a major part of the economy. One of the other excerpts here were kind of related to this, and also some of the human, I think, innovation that had to occur once they lost the ability to have that free labor, right? I think we've seen that today. Constraints will create innovation, create opportunities for innovation, right, and mechanization. And Waco right now, we've got a large shortage. Our economy is growing faster than we can grow our workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So you're starting to see companies be more innovative, going into fast food places now, and there's no one to take an order. You go to a machine and place your order. Those are labor-saving devices because companies can't find labor. But anyway, the handbook says, here and there, as the eye surveys the town in all directions, again, this is the guy up in the cupola, are seen of the vapory jets sent from various substantial buildings in which steam is employed in important manufacturing tasks. So you love, as an engineer, I love that idea, right? The steam age is in full swing. Those machines are getting employed in different ways. In fact, we talked about that in the air conditioning podcast. That's the main driver for how they were able to produce ice using these steam engines, but they were being used for multiple things. And in the old bird's eye pictures of Waco, the maps, if you ever get to see those, and they show all these dirty smokestacks everywhere. That was just a beautiful sign of progress.
That was progress, yeah.
So,
yeah, we see this in some larger cities around this time with these fights against smoke and smoke pollution. But it's seen as progress, right? This is a good thing.
Yeah.
We've got smoky skies.
Yeah.
So, well, I said we're going to get to 1900, but I think that's a pretty good cutoff because I think we've established a good kind of foundation for this early phase of kind of Crossroads. I think as cotton, if we've introduced it, it's really cemented with the Cotton Palace, which starts in 1894, and that's going to be a great thing to tease to talk about when we get into Waco as an entertainment crossroads. There's also educational institutions that are popping up during this period that won't be mentioned here. because those we'll talk about in our
Yep.
our education crossroads episode. Anything else you think ought to make sure we get in today as we lay this kind of early historic foundation?
No, I think that's a good place to stop. We'll start seeing we're at some point going to talk about some of the political crossroads that happened in Waco. There were a lot of significant, not only people but events that have happened here over the years, and as Waco grew in prominence through this time period, right, and its cotton dominance and the there's some cool stuff there that we'll dig into later.
Yeah, I think so. All right, well, thanks, Rick.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for listening, and just stay tuned for episode 3 coming out soon.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Reach San Antonio.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.